I can remember I sat back in the snow and I said, yes, I want a guru. It was kind of interesting. And then the next day, my brother came up to me and he said, wow, I've met this person, and he came back from India with Kirpal Singh. And so to me, it was a graduation to, I could sense that Kirpal Singh was a saint. He was a enlightened being. This was the first time I would say I was introduced to that possibility that here was somebody of the highest order, sort of like one with God, not just on the way, but they had reached some sort of accomplishment. And so it was interesting how I was introduced to that after that prayer, you might say. I thought that was synchronistic, and seeing how the universe can come into play.
Hello and welcome to Curious Ones podcast by Yandara. I'm Yael Ginsberg, the host of the podcast, a yoga and meditation teacher and philosophy lover. Each week you will hear eye-opening interviews with the different teachers of the Yandara Yoga Institute located in beautiful Baja, Mexico, along with other teachers that pass through here. This life-changing knowledge shared through authentic, heartfelt communication will help you live a happier, more fulfilled, and connected life. Let's dive in. Today, I have Craig Perkins here with me. Craig is the co-founder of Yandara. He attended his first yoga teacher training in 1968 and has continued his yoga studies and other disciplines as well, including Chinese yoga, Tai Chi, and Qigong ever since. He studied different styles of yoga and meditation and studied with many great teachers, which is what we're going to speak about today. And he's also the co-author of the book Yandara, Teaching Yoga from the Heart. So welcome to the podcast, Craig. So today we wanted to speak about the different enlightened masters that you have met and your relationship with them, their effect that they had on you. So maybe we can start with a little explanation of what is a guru for you.
Well, when you say I've had association with different enlightened masters, you might say, I would say there's different degrees of that. And as a range. So one of the, I guess one of the benefits of these teachers is not necessarily their philosophies or their studies around this, the information they have. It's more like being in their energy is valuable to us, and it can be sort of quantified. Well, one, not really a yogi, but definitely a spiritual being with Mitek Wirkus, who was he had a gift from childhood where he had his healing qualities, and they actually built an entire hospital around him, apparently. He is so powerful. And when he came to the West, he started teaching, and he has actually just only does individual sessions with people. But the Mayo Clinic did some studies with him where they had a client or a patient or whatever you're going to call it was sitting hooked up to an electrocephalogram, sort of a biofeedback device, checking the wavelength of the brain. And when Mitek walked into the room, it clearly went into a beautiful state, a state of harmony or coherence, you might say. So I think that's one of the determining factors when you talk about being around somebody, because they can have great oratory, information, everything, and enthusiasm and stuff. But to me, unless they have that quality of Shaktipat, would just by pure presence would affect us. I think that's really important. And so since about 1967 or 66, this time what I've spent with different human beings with gifts, we'll call them, has been a spectrum of that. And so I just wanted to clarify that. But one of the themes I feel a message is that one of my first teachers, Barry Burkitt, he wasn't wasn't an advanced yogi or anything like this, but he reached out and he had some qualities. And so I encourage people who are endeavoring to be yoga teachers and things like this, that they don't have to be enlightened beings in order to be of benefit to people.
Of course.
And I think that there's so much appreciation for Barry, who reached out to me. And
What do you mean reached out?
He just started talking about Tibetan Buddhism. Yes. And so that was very valuable to me, even though I didn't have a clue what was going on. I mean, I was coming out of the 50s, you might say, mentality, and I was the ski club and basketball and everything. And at that time, there was no consideration of a more elevated or preferred state of consciousness. It was just, everything was just, happy days. And so for him to reach out to I had resistance to that because I didn't know what he was talking about. Not a clue. It was interesting. But he was, just persistent and even, and just kept saying things that were of value.
Do you remember something that stuck with you?
Well, it was Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And so he just jumped into the whole idea of, of the guide, the Tibetan guide, as you're going through these different states of consciousness to guide us into the pure light. And not be distracted by the various bardo planes that come up, and all this very esoteric stuff. At the same time, I think some of the most esoteric teachings are based on the Tibetan Book of Dead. And so it was interesting. I was, introduced to that, the most advanced, you might say, the most difficult to comprehend, but. There was, I'm just saying it was a value.
Yeah. So today we can speak about it nonchalantly because you have had many, 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 many years of experience in this world. But I'm sure at the time I can understand where the resistance comes. And I feel like many, if not all of us, experience some sort of resistance when we first get to know the teachings, in addition to having also the experience of kind of feeling that we can find the answers to questions that we might not even have known that we have. We had a longing that wasn't fulfilled, but we didn't know what that longing was.
Yes.
And that's kind of what happens when you start to hear these teachings. It's kind of like resonates with something that you already had inside, but you didn't quite know that you did.
Right, exactly.
And I think also about like the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying that you mentioned. It's one of the basic teachings, or the most profound teachings. And I think there are very many esoteric concepts there, but there are also many basic concepts, like the impermanence of all things. Like nobody can argue that everything is all the time changing.
Yes.
So it is easy in a way to connect to that.
Yes, it did. It sort of alienated me from my gang, my buddies, and all of a sudden I was. I remember very clearly going on a drunken ski trip, and me getting drunk and standing on top of the table and saying, "Praise Buddha, praise Buddha." Now, back in the 1966, believe me, that was extremely out of the ordinary. You got drunk every Friday night and that was it. It was for not rednecky, but that kind of, so that's just all there was. So that kind of alienation happened. And then, the next teacher I had some inner experiences around his training. It happened sort of spontaneously. So that gave me a little bit of an insight into things. It's a complicated story to get into, but basically I did have a basic near-death experience where I experienced some of what was could be experienced, you might say. And so around that experience, something opening occurred in me. And the next step was to meet Ananda Bhavanani. Now, he was a direct disciple of Shivananda, Swami Shivananda, from that lineage. And again, it was very fascinating because all of a sudden there was some interest in that 1 year period, like 1966 to 1967. There was an awakening with the Beatles and Maharishi, Mahesh Yogi, and all this stuff. So yoga actually very quickly became very popular, the whole concept of meditation and things like this. So there was a transition. There was some appeal to that, which was, and I found new friends, new people, new associations as I moved out of where I was in North Vancouver to Vancouver. And there was a little bit more, near the art schools and stuff. And so there was a whole hippie thing merging around that.
Yeah.
But I do remember Ananda Bhavanani, and I studied with him. That's who I got my first certification in yoga teacher training, although it was just a one-on-one thing that happened. There was no formal packed group. We just worked together until he decided that, I could teach in the Shivananda style.
So that's more close to the guru-disciple relationship than a classical teacher training.
Yes. And so Barry Burkitt, he was just a Westerner who was introduced some of these things. And here was, even though he was from Alberta, and he was I don't know what his heritage was. I think he was either Italian or maybe from India. That's funny. I don't really know. Anyways, he definitely had the whole yogic background really solid. And so I remember him opening up to me in a very practical way the teachings of yoga and how it could transform our lives. And that culminating in an experience when I was a teacher, but still with him, where I felt something very strong, a very strong experience. I remember sitting in front of my class as I was his teacher and experiencing something quite phenomenal. And at the same time, remembering the times I had with him. So it started to open up another state of consciousness that was preferred, I would say. It was more uplifting. There was some magic there.
And you relate that to the relationship with the teacher.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, his transference, his ability, not just in physical teachings, but his presence, again, was a strong influence. It was good.
Wow. So from there, you were teaching yoga. You had met already 2 significant teachers on your path.
Right.
Where did you go from there?
Yes, it's hard to remember precisely the sequence, but definitely it was with the Tibetan Buddhism. I was initiated in Tibetan Buddhism by Sawan Jimmy, I think his name was. And they had come over from from Tibet. They were out of Tibet and into India, and then they came to Vancouver. And so there was, I was initiated in Tibetan Buddhism, doing all their practices and everything. And so that was another experience that added a dimension of things. Then, and again, it's just an appreciation of people reaching out. And when they're doing their Om Mani Padme Hum, Mani Padme Hum, Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. It was, it was like really cool. It's like, wow, they're all chanting like that. And again, I was like 18 or something. So this was going on there. And also I wasn't at that point, because there was no role models of what a yoga teacher did. I didn't realize I was too young to have yoga studios and things like this. I had a 5,000 square foot yoga studio and classes all the time. And I was 18 years old, and max, I was 50 people in my class one time. I didn't know that I couldn't do that.
Wow. Incredible that like not having the limitation of it made you able to do it at such a young age. And I think that maybe we can frame that as an important lesson, because so many times our limitation of what we think we can do really does end up limiting our reality. And a technique that I've learned, maybe you can share one as well, is to find people who inspire you, who were able to do what you strive to do, but don't have an example of it around you, and let that be an inspiration that it is possible. Let's say you find somebody with a similar background or a similar upbringing that has done something that you have done or that you want to do, and you let that be kind of like there's a woman called Lacey Phillips. She calls it as an expander. Like it expands your awareness to what is possible. Maybe you can also share your approach to how do we let go of the limitation of what is possible for us.
Yeah, I think that I would say the message is what happened, because I didn't have any limiting guidelines. So look at your own self and see, because one of the whole idea of me sitting here is to encourage people to be yoga teachers. That's what we do at Yandara. We get people yoga teachers because it's incredible and it's a wonderful way to help people. And I think to be empowered to not limit yourself with other seemingly, not necessarily, role models, but we see certain people in certain lights and we want to be like them or we want to emulate them, but also to be empowered that, hey, if I can do it 18 years old and have a following, I wasn't gifted or anything in a certain way. I just had a lot of, get up and go. And I just was very positive about that. That's what I would say. Don't be limited by what's around us.
In a way, hearing that you were able to do it is also an expander. You know?
Exactly. Yeah. So the next teacher that I came across is a Shamacharya. And it's very interesting. This is so wild sometimes. Like 50 years later, 45 years later, I'm in Bali and I met this guy who was at our yoga teacher training, and he knew Shamacharya.
Really?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, can you imagine the possibility of that happening? Because he went back to India shortly after he was in Vancouver for a while. But it was nice. I mean, he was a regular yoga teacher. He wasn't necessarily all that much of a spiritual being. I'm just saying from the beginning, I was saying different qualities, but he definitely educated us into the practical elements of Yatha, pretty much in a more advanced way than perhaps Ananda Bhavanani. So he was very much into some of the practical elements of the teachings, and we did retreats and organized a big retreat for the summer up in the mountain on a ski resort
with him,
an abandoned ski resort. We had hundreds of people come up there from Vancouver. And had a big retreat. Like I say, I just did all this stuff. Wow. And back then, by the way, a theme is, if you look at Woodstock, which was a huge movement, there was nobody over 30 years old. All the people who organized, all the musicians, all the people who organized that were 25 years old. No, there was nobody over 30. It's fascinating. It was empowerment of youth empowerment, you might say, younger people. If you look at that, and there was some really strong movements afoot. Yeah. So you mean to say that in order to empower younger people to know that they're able to do things like that? Yeah. Because a lot of relevant to people are making choices coming out of college and everything, and they come to Yandara, and they're at a stage of life. They are kind of 23, 24, some older 30, but everything like this. But there is a sense of that's the demographics that we get here.
Yeah.
And so I do like to encourage people that to go ahead and push through. Don't wait till you're 50. And also I just want to, this is just a story because I think it's kind of fascinating what happened to me. And me, I was almost like Guruji's Meeting with Remarkable Men, the book. It's fascinating to see all these people. There was one, I can't remember his name, but he was a yogi. He was 93 years old. And he was a personal friend of Mahatma Gandhi. He came to Vancouver. And he was making some presentation. He hadn't eaten any food for 3 years. He was a breatharian, water and air. And he was the same thing. You sat in his presence. I just didn't speak English. You sat in his presence and you felt something. You felt the Shaktipat. And it was, again, it's like, oh my God, what one person can do, another can do. Like, wouldn't that be cool if we could reach that state? Not necessarily about not eating. I don't think it's a big deal. It's phenomenal. It's interesting. It's miraculous almost. But it was more like his presence was so sweet and calm and uplifting. So he was definitely in the range of some enlightened yogi. Again, inspiration. Yeah. An inspiration around that. Then, this is just a story. Part of the thing, there's no message. This is a story. When I look back, I think it's pretty phenomenal.
Hey, I'm quickly interrupting the episode to extend an invitation. If you are interested in deepening into any of the subjects we talk about on the podcast, we offer many different experiences on our beautiful grounds here in Baja, Mexico. From 9-day modules such as sound healing and yoga nidra to breath and meditation, as well as 200 or 300-hour yoga teacher trainings and many different shorter retreats. Check out our website, yandara.com, to see all the information about the different experiences. Let's get back to the episode.
Then I found the book Autobiography of a Yogi. And I was so inspired. And I can remember I was a ski instructor too, all this. At the same time that I was doing these yoga classes and everything, I was also a ski instructor in the winter months. And I remember reading the book Autobiography of a Yogi, and I was so inspired by it. It's so moving. And you should read the book. It's just really cool. Yeah. Classic yoga, story of a yogi. And I can remember I sat back in the snow and I said, yes, I want a guru. It was kind of interesting. And then the next day, my brother came up to me and he said, wow, I've met this person, and he came back from India with Kirpal Singh. And so to me, it was a graduation to, I could sense that Kirpal Singh was a saint. He was a enlightened being. This was the first time I would say I was introduced to that possibility that here was somebody of the highest order, sort of like one with God, not just on the way, but they had reached some sort of accomplishment. And so it was interesting how I was introduced to that after that prayer, you might say. I thought that was synchronistic, and seeing how the universe can come into play. And then, and then going to India and experiencing for the first time an enlightened being, a sense of, there's some teachers who are very, I would say, a great gift, but also egocentric. Great orators, great message. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah. But it's a strong personality, I would say. Whereas Kirpal Singh was the epitome of humility and simplicity. And, you know, it's like even things like there's this ashram built around him. He probably had, 50,000 followers. He was an enlightened being. It was just obvious, something incredible going on there. And he lived on one little section of the ashram. He had his own house. He always earned his, he was retired and had a pension, which he lived on. And he donated money to the Sangat. He didn't take any money for anything.
Wow.
And
that is rare.
Yes, it is rare.
Yeah.
And it was something beautiful, and that he took his money and helped the Sangat. And he would have also, like Mother Teresa, not just a teaching, but also an example of helping out, orphanages and an old age home and things like this, where he really went out and helped the people as well as being a completely spiritual teacher, where I was initiated into light and sound practice, in inner light and sound, basically working on the planes of consciousness, including and beyond the third eye, what the chakras above, you might say, depending on who you're talking to, five planes of consciousness above the third eye. And to be initiated into that experience where he connected you with the light and sound within. And so there was that spiritual side of him. And I remember I guess I was 19, and first time I'd traveled anywhere in the world. I don't think the first time I'd been on a plane, actually. And certainly not around air conditioning, and arriving in India, and it was 118 degrees in the shade.
Oh.
And anybody who's been to India, there was an interesting thing where you have the untouchables living right outside the airport. They're basically living in garbage. And so that's a very potentially traumatizing to see the suffering that goes on in the world, and to drive through Delhi. And it's pretty much a lot of traffic and stuff going on, and coming into the ashram, in old Delhi, coming across the bridge and entering the compound. And you initially could feel, there's a lot of stuff going on. India's crowded, it's not exactly peaceful. It's a zoo kind of middle. And I remember entering into the ashram, and I hadn't slept very well. It was hot, so I was like, really out of it kind of thing. And in that, I think that altered state, you might say, I could see like a golden energy coming from part of the ashram. And the closer I came, it became stronger,
Wow.
And it was like amazing. There was a physical manifestation of beauty, of radiance, visually. You could see it palpably, more like you could feel it with your eyes. And so it was wonderful. And I spent, I think, the first about month and a half or something there. And it was nice, he talked, you occasionally get a little audience with him, and, he could tell the future. He just told me the future is in a very cryptic sense,
Can you share maybe something that he shared with you?
Well, it was a funny thing, but I mean, you're supposed to stay in the ashram, and I was trying to endeavor to live in India. And because I wanted to be close to him. And so I was putting together a business at the same time. And so the administrator said, well, you can't do that, and, you're not supposed to do that. But I went to Kirpal Singh, and he says, no, that's okay. Because he knew that I was going to create a business. I created an import business, and he knew, there's other things going on I can't talk about necessarily, but I don't feel comfortable with his guidance on certain things. But it was fascinating how, he knew that it was okay for me to be doing that, where it didn't fit in the rule book, but he knew what was happening. He knew that was going to enable me to come to India more often. And I did start an import business, Art East Imports, and I don't know, it's just like he knew things that beyond that which most people could not comprehend. I had no idea about. It was pretty interesting. But again, it's just like this. There was just some humility where, they said, well, you should get a new car and all this stuff. And he has like 50,000 at least people, and he has like 10,000 people coming to his ashram, on the weekly ashram. He was friends with Indira Gandhi. I mean, he was a head of the World Fellowship of Religions and everything as an aside. Not, to me, that wasn't a phony thing. It was heartfelt. He was endeavoring to do things that were beneficial, as well as being an individual spiritual guide to people. But they said they wanted to get a new car. I said, no, the ambassador's just fine. And his, his clothes aren't all of a sudden like 100% pristine. He didn't care a little so much. And it was just fascinating to be around somebody who could do that. It was inspiring beyond human comprehension, I would say.
Yeah.
A loving simplicity. And you watched him walk across the compound, and his, just the way he moves his hands, the grace of who he was mesmerizing. To see that. And, just sort of like, one of the biggest miracles, I would say, I've seen in my life, although miracles is a strange word because I think it's all science, but his son, who took on the mantle after he died, Darshan Singh, when we were going, he had that time, this was years later, seeing Kirpal Singh first time was 1969. He died in 74. So I had seen him about 4 or 5 times. And between that time, spent some time with him. But his son took over, and it was a very, I'm not sure to what degree. It feels like a very enlightened being. But I remember that we were having he was having a tour. Darshan Singh was having a tour of United States and Europe. And we all had, by that time, had centers set up all around in that 10-year period from 1970 around there to maybe 80, something like that, 10 years. We had set up different ashrams and centers around North America and Europe. Anyways, he was coming on tour, and he came to Chicago. And there was a center there in Chicago as well, but they felt the logistics of transporting everybody there was going to be difficult. So they had the whole program at the O'Hare Hilton. And the O'Hare Hilton is possibly, if one could imagine, is probably the least likely place to have a 3-day meditation retreat. I mean, probably right down there at the least inappropriate place in the world. It's very noisy, very dirty, at the intersection of highways and the airport. And it was fascinating. And so arriving there on Thursday, some of us who were traveling, the vibrations were not that great. And I guess it's just an incredible experience. He arrived on Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, he had turned that hotel palpably into an ashram. Just one person, if you could believe. The hallways. This is the hotels open to the public,
Yeah.
And he had turned the hallways, everything, into an ashram. You walk down, and it was grace flowing through every room, everything like this. It was the biggest miracle I've ever seen in my life. It's just like his energy was so in tune, so in coherence, you might say, that he changed they've changed the vibrations of the entire hotel in 12 hours.
Wow.
And it was really something. And those are things you say, this is interesting.
Yeah. I guess you would have to be there to fully understand the scope of the miracle.
Yes, it would be.
But it's interesting and inspiring to hear about your experience, for sure.
Yeah, it's very hard to prove these things, in a sense, because it's beyond the intellect. It's an experience which is hard to quantify. But these are, I think, I guess another, element here is that, again, it's possible for us to aspire to these things. Aspire, we're going to be mathematicians or whatever, we're going to be doing, airline pilots, doctors. What if we aspired to be yogis? And recognizing, as you said, what a person can do, another person can do. Some of these people were actually probably dropped from heaven, or born with that. Yeah. But others clearly worked all their lives to create this experience.
I would even argue that an enlightened master kind of arrived maybe at this lifetime with all the work that he has already done, or she has already done before. Yeah. And then in that way, they are born with it.
Yes. To some degree, yes. It does happen.
But I think it's interesting that you say that, because there are different levels that we can affect the people around us. So not everybody needs to have a 50,000 people community, but even being able to affect like a 10-person class is already in itself a meaningful thing.
I mean, sometimes even your own children.
Yeah.
Or your own partner or something. There's also that level as well. It's all, I think it's important for us to look at those things. Yeah,
because it is true that our energy speaks louder than our words. This is actually a saying from one of my teachers, Gabby Bernstein. She had it in one of her books, and she explains there the concept that really our energy that we emanate from ourselves is much stronger than the words that we might use. So working on the energy level of our spirit is a meaningful thing, even if it might be hard to quantify or measure or prove, as you said.
Yeah, I think getting the practice part of it is, I think that a lot of people are introduced to yoga in terms of hatha yoga and going to yoga class and feeling some experience. And, also, I mean, we're talking about how do we achieve these things? How do we achieve this? And I think at Yandara, we have put together in a small way and maybe a big way a formula where people come for 17 to 23 days, and we're giving them the tools and the experience, very practical things that they can do to achieve a preferred state of consciousness. And the majority of the people come away, I mean, as well as the practical element of being able to teach a yoga class, a physical hatha yoga exercise class, is to find ways to put themselves into a state of coherence or a state of upliftment to some degree, a loving consciousness. And I think it's of value to say, oh, this is what we did. Here's 6 things that we did, or 7 or 8 things, practices that we were here beyond this, the teaching of physical yoga class. We introduce all these things. And so at the end, majority of people feel an upliftment. They feel that they have established a different state of consciousness, and they walk away with the tools to be able to further that. So not just like, this is what happened. They can go back into their lives and do these different practices, the different, what do you call it? Ashtanga yoga, what's it called? The limbs, the different limbs of yoga manifest in more of a Western understanding, because sometimes the Eastern is a little bit hard for us Westerners to comprehend. But I think we've synthesized it into how it can be understood from Western thinking.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable the effect of a yoga teacher training and the immersion aspect of being in a place like this that has trained yogis for 15 years and more. And there is definitely a huge effect on that, and being in nature in this beautiful place with like-minded people. All of this has an extreme effect on our energy level, our consciousness on many different levels. Maybe you can also give a few guidance points for people maybe in preparation for a training. How do they start to shift into this state of being? Or maybe somebody who isn't quite ready yet for a training right now, something that they can do at home right now.
To me, I've sort of used the acronym of MASS, M-A-S-S, in nature, for sometimes to clarify a little bit. But I think the first one is meditation, and that is presence. And so I think that any time that we can do practices that are classic meditations that most people are familiar with, just closing your eyes and internalization instead of being constantly externalized, but simply, I would say, moving from head to heart, from thinking to feeling, from fear to love. But there is this element here of presence. And I think that more people can sit down quietly and not be reading or writing or thinking, to just be aware of the sensations of their body, aware of the sensations of the air entering, leaving the lungs, basically moving into body consciousness, you might say, in the more spiritual sense of the word. And around that, I think that mass in nature is that nature is very powerful. So taking time to be alone in nature and feeling our feelings, I think, is helpful, very beneficial. We don't think about it, but nature is one of the yogis, one of the spiritual gurus.
100%.
Yeah. And the next one is asana practice. Of course, that's natural to be, in a sense, to maintain good body health, because you can't, as they say, you can't go very far on a sick horse.
Yes, definitely.
So it's important, as you're saying, in the preparation, to find through exercise, through health, eating well, and all sorts of are really important for us. And I think some people I've seen are emphasizing too much meditation, you might say, or too much sort of the basic teachings, and ignore their physical health to some degree. I mean, that's not mainstream people, but I mean, there's another side of it, that it's important to not only be a meditator, but also have the physical health and well-being. So the Hatha Yoga is a science of optimum physical health.
Yeah, I find it interesting that in the 8 limbs that you mentioned of yoga, which is, for those who don't know, it is the kind of the basic guidelines of the yogi. Sorry, the mosquito. Do no harm. So the aspect of the asana practice, the physical practice, is one of 8 parts. And another part of the 8 parts is the meditation, meaning that they have a similar size of the pie chart, if you will, in order in aspect of the importance they have in the physical, in the spiritual journey.
Yeah. So the next one is the next M-A-S, first S is satsang, and that is the company of those people who have good energy, basically. So, not necessarily, I would say, I don't, not necessarily hang around people who are drunk or alcoholic, or aggressive, and, all these things, and, people who are kind and healthy and vibrant and things. Having the company of good people is an integral part of the practice that we can work with. people who are not ideally just angry and, upset all the time, not upset at something else, but, just a positive energy, including going to a classic satsang, sometimes you don't know where to go to a Sikh temple sometimes, it's pretty amazing, you can just feel some of these things. There's certain Hindu temples and things like this, I found it can be quite valuable for us. It seems culturally a little bit odd for us to be there, but there's some beautiful things there. But is there any yoga satsangs and music and kirtan? And the next one is a little bit more interesting, and that is satya, or truthfulness. That's a classic practice that people can do, or find somebody who you can, instead of putting on a personality all the time, to try and integrate and sort of vipassana type things, just to see who we really are instead of putting on a persona. It's a lot to go into there, but that's a whole other area. But the idea of truthfulness, the idea of not necessarily not telling lies, but introspection verbally about who we really are and everything. And the next one is seva, and that is doing good works without any consideration of return. It is a very powerful foundation piece of the limbs of yoga, seva. And it is good to go consideration financially and physically to do things for people. And recognizing from a scientific point of view, you don't lose anything. You don't lose any money. You gain money. That's a ridiculous thing to say, but you're not losing anything when you are giving. And it's a foundation of giving so much of your time and money. Actually, sometimes I just really I just really enjoy over tipping the grocery store package and the person pumping gas and everything, and it feels good to me, just give them a day's wages, or something, it's like direct contact, not necessarily giving to a charities, which can or can't be good, but I do feel it's kind of nice to do things like that. And I can see there is a benefit sometimes, and sometimes we are taught, we'll look after our money and all this stuff, share a little bit and be surprised. It doesn't hurt that much financially to do things and just help people out.
I also want to ask you, if somebody wants to start learning from gurus and different teachers, where would you recommend for them to start looking? I think it's maybe if somebody isn't able to travel to India to find an enlightened teacher.
Well, what I've noticed more, this is actually a changing of a paradigm, where when I was growing up, we did reach remarkable men, and I think something's happening. This is a little bit going out there a little bit, but I think since 1982, around there have been incarnations of people like yourself who are considered normal, you might say, but I think we have much more gifts than we think we do. So I think we're looking around. I don't notice as many gurus as that I did. Like, I don't know where there's something I'm not, there's not as many of them around. And I think they are with people who are around us sometimes. And this is fascinating. I don't think it was happening so much back in the 50s, where there would be some of an enlightened nature, just be our, people around. I think that we, the story is, I don't know, around some 1980, people started to be reincarnates. And they had a background, and all of a sudden they're born in this world, in the Western world, and be seemingly fairly normal people. But they had, when you look in a little bit deeper, because I know as a lot of people come to Yandara, there's a lot of, saints, people there. And so all of a sudden we're looking for this guru up on a pedal and is famous or something, like a pedestal. And all of a sudden you look around and you say, you look into the eyes of our travelers, and we say, here's a guru right now. And I think it is a shifted paradigm. There is that happening. And it wasn't happening 25 years ago. It wasn't happening. It's happening now. It's like, I mean, it happened to some degree, I suppose, back then, but it's happening more and more. So there's a shifted paradigm in terms of perhaps the spiritual teachers, you know, that there's something there that is, look around sometime. Look around with your heart eyes rather than your brain eyes and say, who is this? Well, look at this person who's right beside me. You know, and it takes some discrimination, or not discrimination, discernment. And you can start to see, you know, it's like you start to see the depth of people instead of their external accomplishments, which our society mostly looks at, you know, car, job, things like this.
Yeah.
You look at what is their essence. And, you know, it's interesting. So you start to, it's like satsang, you start to be around people like that and start to associate with people. You start to learn a sort of intuitive understanding, and you sit guided by that. And you start to see, well, this is something beautiful that can happen. And when we are encouraged to be aware of that possibility, and we start to, you know, I do feel there's sort of a, in the middle of this chaos of our world, which is a little bit chaotic these days and difficult, there is something happening.
Yeah.
There is an awakening on a very evolved spiritual level. And again, you know, because one of the benefits, I'm 74 years old, and I did get to see what life was back in the 50s and how it's been changing. So I have a perspective where somebody your age may not have seen how it was 50 years ago. It was very linear.
Wow.
It was beautiful, but it was simple. But also there was something else. There's something else that has evolved over this period of time. I mean, just a simple thing like yoga went from like, you know, I don't know, 10,000 people or 10 million, I don't know what 10 million people in the United States. And now it's like 50 million people in the United States and Canada practice yoga. That in itself is pretty representative of something.
I think it's so easy for us to think about all the bad things that are happening and maybe even be critical of that. But in the long term of history, we have evolved and advanced so much that in that way, it can give us a lot of hope.
Yeah.
Craig, is there something else that you would like to add?
I think that's good.
Great. So just as a last question, I always end with this one. What are you curious about right now?
I'm curious about what's going to happen in the future. I think that things are not going so well externally, politically. And I'm curious to see how this loving consciousness is going to manifest in our difficult world.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
Craig, thank you so much.
All right.
Now, after this time to nurture your mind and your spirit, we invite you to take a moment to consider others. A kind wish might come to mind. Know that what we learn becomes more valuable when we apply it and share it with others. So share this episode on Instagram stories, tag Yandara and I, or share with a loved one so that more people can benefit from it. Our hope is that the search will lead you home to who you already are, to what was always there. We'll be back next week with more inspiration, honest conversation, and insight into the energetic world around us. Thank you for listening and watching.